In a world of corporate intrigue and personal ambition, Julian Blackwood dedicated 7 years of his life to climbing the ladder at Cressmont Industries, hoping for recognition and success. But one fateful day, his world crumbles. He is fired, and his wife files for divorce, leaving him with nothing. Betrayed and humiliated, Julian disappears, not to surrender, but to be reborn. He secretly owns a consulting firm that manipulates his offender's empire and begins to exact revenge, skillfully pulling the strings from the shadows. Cressmont Industries begins to collapse from within. Deals fall through, partners turn away, and stocks plummet. Eliza, Julian's ex-wife, desperately tries to maintain her social image, but her world starts to disintegrate. Julian watches their agony, feeling neither triumph nor gloating, but only cold satisfaction. He creates Vanguard Horizons, a new consulting firm that eclipses Cressmont, rewriting the rules of the business world. When Eliza tries to return to his life, Julian rejects her, realizing that he outgrew the past long ago. Julian Blackwood becomes the architect of a new reality, where his influence is undeniable, and revenge takes shape without a single word. Stay with us to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I had believed it to be merely another routine evaluation, one more checkmark on the endless, soul-crushing list of responsibilities that had become synonymous with the 7 years of my life I'd surrendered to Cressmont Industries. 7 years of sleepless nights in the fluorescent hum of the office, cold takeout containers piling up on my desk as I chased impossible deadlines. 7 years of missed anniversaries, rain-soaked commutes, and sacrifices that had cost me friendships I hadn't even had the time to mourn. And all of it, I'd thought, was leading somewhere, to some corner office, some meaningful reward, some acknowledgement that everything I'd poured into that company mattered. So, as I straightened my tie that morning and entered the sterile white walls of the conference room, the polished glass table reflecting my own composed facade, I told myself to remain calm, to expect another checklist of goals and achievements, perhaps even a nod of appreciation from the man at the head of the table, Frederick Langston, my father-in-law, the king of this corporate castle. Frederick's face, as always, was an unreadable mask, that severe, stony expression giving nothing away. He sat with his hands neatly folded before him, the Cressmont logo gleaming on the tablet he hadn't even bothered to unlock. His voice, when it came, was a cold blade twisting in my gut. "We're letting you go. Performance issues." At first, I thought I'd misheard. The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet. I waited for him to elaborate, to expand, to offer even the thinnest veneer of pretense that this was anything more than what it was, a clinical execution. But Frederick simply stared, his mouth a flat line, daring me to argue. Performance issues. As if the years of blood and sweat I'd given them had simply evaporated, forgotten the moment I was no longer of use. The HR manager, a woman who had once lauded my work ethic at corporate retreats, slid a folder across the table towards me. Severance terms, a non-disclosure agreement, a list of what I was no longer permitted to do, to say, to be. I walked out through the glass lobby with a cardboard box in my hands and a hollow, mechanical smile plastered on my face, exchanging forced handshakes and meaningless, all the best wishes with people who couldn't even meet my gaze. The air outside was sharp and unforgiving, the winter sun blinding with cruel indifference. I stood there for a moment, my breath misting in the cold air, wondering how everything could unravel so quickly, so cleanly, as if I'd never mattered at all. Still reeling, I got into my car and drove home, my grip on the steering wheel a white-knuckled clench. Eliza would understand, I told myself, my wife, my partner, my anchor. She would be furious for me. She would say that I wasn't defined by Frederick's verdict, that we would face this together. I played the conversation out in my head a dozen times on the drive, clinging to the hope that at least the one person who loved me would be there when the rest of the world turned away. I should have known better. Pulling up to the house, I saw it immediately. The house looked wrong, silent, still. No welcoming light in the window, no warmth waiting inside. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and there she was, Eliza, standing like a statue by the door. Her bags were already packed, neat and efficient, as if she'd been planning this moment for weeks. She said nothing at first, simply thrusting a large envelope into my chest with clinical precision, as if handing off a package to a stranger. My trembling fingers fumbled with the seal, and inside, I found the divorce papers. Divorce papers, a separate letter annulling the prenuptial clauses she had quietly altered months ago without my knowledge. And to twist the knife further, a glossy brochure for a local homeless shelter. "I don't need you anymore," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You're useless now. Utterly useless." The word echoed in my ears like a gunshot. I looked at her, the woman I had loved, fought for, sacrificed for, and in her cold, detached gaze, I saw the truth. She had never loved me. I had been a tool, a means to an end, someone to elevate her until I was no longer necessary. I didn't shout, I didn't beg. Some small, wounded part of me still retained enough dignity to turn, to walk back out the door, my head held high. I left with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a few crumpled belongings hastily stuffed inside, and a heart quietly shattering in my chest. I didn't even glance back as I closed the door. What was there to see? An empty house, devoid of everything that had once felt like home. The evening sky bled into night as I walked towards my car, my breath catching in short, sharp gasps. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the wheel, staring into the darkness ahead. I could almost hear the laughter. Frederick's smug satisfaction, Eliza's cold triumph. They thought they were done with me. They thought they had taken everything. They were wrong. I turned the ignition, the engine growling beneath me. My hands were steady now, my mind, once clouded with disbelief, sharpening into something colder. I didn't know where I was going yet, or how I would get there, but I made a silent vow right then, under the pitiless stars. They would regret underestimating me. And when they did, it would be far too late. I slept in my car that first night. The seats were hard and cold against my back, the windows fogged with my shallow breaths. I parked on the far side of an abandoned strip mall where the streetlights flickered and died, offering no solace to the cracked asphalt. I pulled my old coat tighter around me, trying to find some sliver of comfort, a tiny spark of warmth to cling to. Sleep came in fits and starts, ripped away by every gust of wind that rattled the frame, every creak and groan of the world shifting outside. In those long, sleepless hours, I stared at the roof of my car and wondered how everything had unraveled so quickly, how a life I had built brick by painstaking brick could be demolished by a few cold words and signatures on paper. By the second night, I knew I had to do better. Pride was a heavy burden, but survival was heavier. Under a different name, I rented a room at a rundown motel on the edge of town, paying in cash, keeping my head down. The clerk barely glanced at me as he slid the bent key card across the counter. The room smelled of bleach and stale smoke, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one remembered faces. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the air conditioner groaned like it was dying, but I stretched out and allowed my body to sink into something resembling rest for the first time in 48 hours. But I wasn't broken, not even close. Lying there, staring at the stained ceiling tiles, I felt a different kind of energy coursing through my veins now. Sharper, colder. They thought they had gutted me, left me hollow and powerless. What Frederick, Eliza, and their petty vindictiveness didn't know was that my years at Cressmont Industries had been a carefully constructed facade, a diversion. The mediocre performance they had criticized was part of a longer game they hadn't even glimpsed. Every spare hour I had carved out had been dedicated to building something more, something real, hidden in the folds of shell corporations and anonymous holdings, something they were blissfully unaware I controlled because they were too busy. congratulating themselves on their superiority. The truth was, I owned the consulting firm that had orchestrated Cressmont's biggest wins. Every major acquisition, every profitable merger, all guided subtly by hands they believed were their own. I had built it quietly, patiently, operating through intermediaries and proxies who shielded me from exposure. Frederick liked to think he was the great architect, never realizing he was a puppet dancing on strings I pulled from the shadows. And now that they had discarded me, deemed me too small, too insignificant to matter, they had cleared the board for me, with no constraints. In that dingy motel room, I began to plan. I wedged the rickety chair under the doorknob, an old habit from a time when I couldn't afford security, and powered on the battered laptop I had salvaged from the trunk of my car. My fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory overriding the exhaustion that threatened to drag me down. First, I secured my real accounts, the ones hidden deep within layers of offshore corporations, nominee companies, and numbered trusts. I rerouted my investments into quiet, liquid channels. Anything even remotely connected to Cressmont or Frederick's empire was isolated, drained, and sealed off without a trace. They thought they had clipped a weakling. They didn't understand they had poured gasoline on a spark. By the third night, I wasn't sleeping anymore. I didn't need to. I was thriving on the feverish energy that came with the final severing of the chains I had worn for too long. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated, a ghost slipping through the walls of the empire they believed was impenetrable. I contacted old allies, people who owed me favors, debts they had never quite repaid. Quiet conversations and encrypted messages, midnight calls from burner phones. One by one, I activated networks they had never suspected existed. I shut down the offshore accounts Frederick unknowingly relied on. I froze the lines of credit that kept Cressmont afloat, assets they considered permanent and untouchable. I pulled the string so carefully, so subtly, that the tapestry didn't rip. It slowly unraveled from within until nothing but ashes remained. They thought they had banished a pawn. They didn't realize I had been the king all along. I watched from the shadows as the first cracks began to appear. Subtle at first, a delayed shipment here, a returned wire transfer there, enough to plant the seeds of doubt in the minds of investors and suppliers. The great patriarch Frederick was too proud to see the trouble until it was too late. And Eliza, ever concerned with appearances, was too busy curating her next social media post to notice the ground shifting beneath her Louboutins. In that grimy motel room, with nothing but a duffel bag, a battered laptop, and a gnawing hunger for justice burning in my chest, I began my quiet descent not into despair, but into resurrection. The world had taken everything from me: my home, my title, my marriage, my reputation. They thought I would fade away like a ghost, forgotten and discarded. But ghosts don't fade, they haunt. And when the time was right, when the foundations they trusted crumbled beneath their feet, they would feel my presence like a cold hand on their shoulder. They would wonder where they had gone wrong, as the walls began to close in, why the air had grown so thin. And they would never suspect the man they had betrayed was sitting patiently in the darkness, watching it all unfold, with a steady hand and a heart as cold and clear as glass. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. My disappearance wasn't dramatic, not headline-grabbing, not the kind Eliza probably fantasized about, some public meltdown that would validate all her cruel words about me. No, my vanishing was quiet, methodical, like a shadow slipping off the edge of a photograph. No angry phone calls, no desperate emails begging for closure, no drunken social media rants or pity-seeking posts. I simply ceased to exist for them. I became a phantom, unreachable, untraceable, and most importantly, uncontrollable. While they basked in what they believed was their victory, I moved in the silence. Every second they spent celebrating was a second I spent tightening the noose around their empire. I knew Frederick's rhythms better than he knew them himself. I knew where he hid his vulnerabilities, the indulgences he allowed himself, the illegal gray areas he justified as just business. I knew which suppliers he leaned on when times got tough, which partners he placated with promises he could never keep. And now, without me quietly smoothing over the cracks behind the scenes, those cracks were going to widen. Using contacts carefully cultivated over years, people whose loyalty I had earned not through threats or money, but through respect and results, I began to reroute investments. Some were men and women whose names Frederick barely remembered, people he dismissed as small players. To me, they were the scaffolding holding up Cressmont. They remembered who had really brokered the deals, who had pulled the all-nighters solving problems they hadn't even known existed. When I called, they answered. When I asked for favors, they didn't hesitate. With a few keystrokes and quiet conversations, I began to pull the threads. Offshore accounts invisibly linked to Cressmont, accounts Frederick depended on for liquidity and leverage, began to freeze, one by one. At first, it was just a slow tightening of cash flow, a missed payment here, a delayed shipment there, things that would seem like minor inconveniences to an outsider. But to someone like me, they were the first deliberate steps of a much larger plan. But I wasn't finished. For years, I had been planting tripwires within Cressmont's infrastructure, quiet ownership stakes buried in patent filings, licensing rights structured through third-party companies, intellectual property registered in jurisdictions they didn't even track. All of it legally mine, just veiled enough for Frederick to believe it was his while he posed for magazine covers and accepted business awards. I had built a hidden foundation beneath him, one that could be collapsed with a single flick of my wrist. One by one, I began to activate those claims. First, I locked down their access to key software licenses that Cressmont needed to run its core logistics. Then, I quietly terminated crucial consulting agreements that fed them their own market data. Contracts they had long taken for granted simply evaporated. In the background, lawsuits began to brew, quiet whispers of breaches and negligence that Frederick would hear too late to stop. From my new sanctuary, an unremarkable rental apartment 2 cities away, the kind of place where no one makes eye contact in the elevator, I watched the chaos bloom. I didn't have to lift a finger. I had already built the machine. Now, I simply let it run. They thought they had banished a pawn. The truth was, I had been the king of this game for years, and now, free from the shackles of pretense, I could move without caution or compromise. I didn't need Cressmont's approval. I didn't need Frederick's blessing or Eliza's cold praise. I had my own empire now, invisible, patient, ruthless. The beauty of it was how little effort it required once the pieces were set in motion. Frederick's pride made him predictable. He would blame others. He would tighten his grip instead of adapting. Eliza, too, would follow her script, playing the victim on social media, weaving narratives to shield herself from consequences she couldn't even foresee. They were creatures of habit, slaves to appearances, and they had no idea the real battle had already been lost. I moved like a ghost through their world, quiet, unseen, yet omnipresent. I had friends in places they never considered, people in law firms, media conglomerates, regulatory agencies. A whisper here, a nudge there. Quiet audits began, questions from journalists trickled in. By the time Frederick noticed the tide turning, it would be too late to stem the flow. Every email they sent now went unanswered. Every number they dialed led to a void. They reached out to mutual acquaintances, desperate for information, for some thread of control. Those loyal to me either ignored the calls or fed them just enough disinformation to keep them confused and agonizing. I wasn't hiding. I was hunting, and they didn't even know it yet. In the long nights, I often wondered what Eliza thought as she watched it all unfold. She had always craved status, the gleam of perfection, the envy of others. To watch it all slip through her fingers must have felt like a slow drowning. Did she blame me? Did she understand that her own betrayal had sown the seeds of her downfall? Or did she simply think the universe was punishing her, as if fate had turned fickle for no reason at all? It didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't doing this to hear their apologies, their pleas, their justifications. Their regrets held no interest for me. What I wanted, what I needed, was something far purer. The satisfaction of knowing they had destroyed themselves by underestimating the man they thought was weak. I didn't want their forgiveness. I wanted their silence, their confusion, their collapse. And so I moved unseen, tightening the noose, thread by invisible thread, until the whole house of cards would tremble at the slightest breath. Because ghosts never shout, they simply watch, and they never leave until the haunting is complete. It started small, with tiny fractures invisible to those who weren't looking closely. A delayed payment to a supplier here, a missed compliance update there, things Frederick would normally wave away with a dismissive gesture, blaming an intern or a temporary system glitch. But I knew better. I watched the ripples spread through Cresmont's foundations, patiently, methodically, knowing that 1,000 tiny cracks could bring down even the tallest tower if left unattended. The first real sign came during what should have been a routine merger, a deal Frederick had been boasting about for months at every industry gala and boardroom lunch. At the last minute, inexplicably, the partner company backed out. No explanation, no negotiation, just a cold email from their lawyers citing concerns about Cresmont's corporate stability. Frederick must have been apoplectic. I pictured him pacing his office, barking orders at his assistants, demanding to know why his empire suddenly looked so fragile. Eliza, no doubt, was plastering on a strained smile at her influencer events, pretending everything was fine while frantically clutching her phone under the table, sending him desperate demands for answers. But there were no answers, not the ones they wanted. The rot had already begun, deep within the walls they thought would protect them. Suppliers, once eager to do business with Cresmont, began to balk at long-term deals, demanding upfront payment instead of trusting long-standing agreements. Contracts Frederick considered ironclad evaporated overnight. Investors, the very men and women who had once hailed him as a visionary leader, began to whisper behind closed doors, questioning the financial projections they had never bothered to scrutinize before. Emergency board meetings were called, crisis management teams assembled, lawyers and PR firms hired like firefighters rushing to a house already half consumed by flames. And all the while, I remained silent. I watched from the shadows as their empire teetered under its own weight, my hands steady, my heart cold. Frederick and Eliza tried to reach me at first, polite, almost casual, as if extending a magnanimous hand to a wayward child. A few emails, veiled in false concern. Hope you're doing okay? Let's talk when you're ready. When I didn't respond, the messages grew sharper, more insistent. Phone calls, voicemails, text messages that flooded the burner phones I discarded as easily as used napkins. 193 missed calls between them in the span of 4 days. It would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so pathetic to witness their scrambling, their slow, agonizing realization that they had made a mistake, that the man they had thrown away wasn't sitting quietly in a corner licking his wounds, but moving invisibly through their kingdom, unraveling it thread by thread. And Eliza, dear, cunning Eliza, played her part exactly as I expected. She took to social media like a woman possessed, weaving a web of carefully curated lies. She portrayed herself as the betrayed, the wounded survivor of some unseen cruelty. Tearful selfies, long posts about healing and moving on from toxic relationships, pictures of her bravely smiling with friends, attending charity galas, vacationing on tropical beaches, all of it staged, hollow. I recognized the desperation beneath the gloss, the frantic need to control the narrative before the truth seeped through and poisoned the perfect image she had cultivated. But no amount of filters or hashtags could save her from what was coming. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every move they made was still part of my plan. Every post Eliza uploaded, every press release Frederick issued, every panicked meeting they held behind closed doors. I saw it all. I had people within their circle, people who owed me favors or simply disliked them enough to not remain loyal when the ship began to sink. I didn't even have to ask. The information flowed to me naturally, like blood from a wound. I was everywhere and nowhere. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to show up and scream, "I told you so," in their faces. That would have been too small, too petty. I wasn't interested in small victories. I was building something larger, a quiet, inexorable reckoning. And the beauty of it was, they wouldn't even realize I was behind it until the final blow landed. There's a certain exquisite cruelty in letting someone build their own gallows, in watching them hammer the nails and tie the rope with their own greedy hands. That's what I was doing, giving them enough rope to swing. I drove past Cressmont headquarters one day in those early weeks, just to see it with my own eyes. The building still gleamed, the flag still snapped in the wind. On the surface, everything looked normal, business as usual. But I could feel the sickness eating away from the inside, could almost taste the fear beginning to permeate the air. The security guard at the gate didn't recognize me, or perhaps he did, and simply looked away. Either way, I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I had already lit the fuse. Now I was just waiting for the smoke to rise. As the days bled into weeks, the panic accelerated. Suppliers demanded upfront payments instead of trusting long-standing agreements. Investors canceled meetings, citing schedule conflicts. A major client terminated their contract without warning, a loss that would bleed millions from Cressmont's quarterly report. Frederick and Eliza must have been scrambling, trying desperately to plug the holes, to assure everyone that everything was fine, that they were still in control. But control is a fragile illusion. Once it cracks, once doubt creeps in, it spreads like a virus, and no amount of charm or money can cure it. I wasn't just dismantling their empire, I was erasing the myth of their invincibility, exposing them for what they had always been. Charlatans propped up by arrogance and stolen labor, too blind to see the hand that fed them until it was withdrawn. I watched, I waited, and I smiled, because the panic was only just beginning. The turning point came on a gray, biting morning, one of those days when even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. It was the day of the emergency board meeting Frederick had called in a desperate attempt to reassure investors, to patch the widening cracks in Cressmont's polished facade. I wasn't there, of course. I didn't need to be. My presence would have been too loud, too obvious. Instead, I sent someone better, an intermediary, a quiet hammer in a bespoke suit who would drive the final nail into the coffin without ever raising his voice. They didn't notice him at first as he entered the boardroom, a manila folder tucked casually under his arm. He wasn't part of their usual retinue, didn't belong to any firm they recognized. Perhaps for a fleeting second, they thought he was an auditor or a compliance officer, someone easily dismissed. But when he neatly laid out the documents in front of each board member, when he spoke the simple sentence, "I suggest you read this carefully before today's vote," the atmosphere in the room shifted. Contained within those plain folders was everything. Proof of Frederick's financial malfeasance, the doctored books, the creative accounting he had relied on to maintain the illusion of Cressmont's steady growth, the forged documents, the phantom, contracts, the hidden debts. I had been collecting it all meticulously for years, a slow accrual of evidence, hidden and untouched until the precise moment. There were copies of leaked communications, text messages and emails between Frederick and Eliza, raw and revealing, showing the depth of their calculated betrayal. They had laughed at my supposed loyalty. Eliza had boasted about how she had kept me in the dark, how she had played me for a fool until she could cut the cord and watch me fall. And, perhaps most satisfying of all, the contracts, real, notarized, legally binding, showing that the critical pieces of Cressmont's infrastructure, the patents and consulting services they depended on, didn't belong to them at all. They were mine, had been mine for years, hidden beneath layers they had never bothered to peel back. It took less than an hour. Less than an hour for Frederick's empire to begin to crumble before the very eyes of the men and women who had once toasted him on stage. I imagined the silence that must have filled that room, the frozen expressions, the way the board members looked at each other, seeing for the first time not an industry titan, but a desperate old man clinging to the wreckage of his lies. Later reports would say that Frederick had gone white, that his hands had trembled as he tried to explain, tried to spin the narrative. But there is a truth that cannot be negotiated, cannot be twisted into something more palatable. The cold, hard facts laid bare need no embellishment. They do their work on their own. Outside, the markets began to react almost immediately. The news spread like wildfire through investor circles, through the press, through the industry. Cressmont's stock, once an unshakable monolith, began a precipitous slide, losing value hour by hour. Suppliers severed ties, fearing the fallout. Clients demanded audits and emergency renegotiations. Competitors circled like sharks, drawn by the scent of blood in the water. And all the while, my phone vibrated incessantly on the cheap laminate table of the coffee shop, where I sat miles away, sipping burnt coffee and watching the collapse unfold on news feeds and frantic email leaks. Call number 194 came from Eliza. I stared at the screen for a long time as it vibrated in my hand, her name flashing on the display like a cruel joke. A part of me, a wounded, almost forgotten part, almost answered. Not because I wanted to hear her voice, not because I missed her, but because some old instinct wanted to witness the panic in her words, to hear the fear she never thought she would experience. But I didn't answer. I let it ring, let her unanswered voice slip into the digital void, another ghost in the machine. She no longer deserved an audience. Instead, I finished my coffee, pushed the cup away, and stood to leave. The sun had finally broken weakly through the overcast sky. I had things to do, plans to continue, and I wasn't going to waste another second on the people who had discarded me the moment they thought I was no longer useful. They had played their part. Their downfall was in motion. Now it was time for me to finish building something better. Stepping out into the thin winter light, I felt no anger, not even triumph, not in the cartoonish way one might imagine. There was no laughter, no fist-pumping, no shouting to the heavens that I had won. What I felt was something quieter, deeper, a clean, cold satisfaction that settled into my bones. Justice doesn't always arrive with fireworks and applause. Sometimes it comes with silence, with a slow, inevitable collapse that no one can stop once it has begun. And I had all the time in the world to watch it unfold. Betrayal ages poorly under the harsh glare of the spotlight. It rots from the inside out faster than even the betrayer expects. Eliza had built her entire life around appearances, the carefully curated Instagram posts, the photographs from charity galas, the magazine mentions that lauded her as a rising socialite. Every smile was rehearsed, every shared moment filtered, staged, performed for an audience hungry for envy. But now, as the truth seeped out like water through a cracked dam, her perfect facade was crumbling, and the audience she had once cultivated was turning away, cold and unforgiving. It started subtly, as these things often do. The designers who had once clamored to dress her for events suddenly had regrettable sizing issues. The friends who had once showered her comments with hearts and adoration grew strangely silent. Invitations to carefully selected gatherings dwindled and then ceased altogether. Brands abruptly terminated her lucrative influencer partnerships, citing shifts in internal policy and concerns about brand image. And no one, not one of those glittering friends, not one of the obsequious assistants or PR managers, offered a hand as she fell. Screenshots of her old, boastful text messages leaked to the media, messages dripping with disdain for the people she pretended to adore, comments about how she had manipulated me, how she had laughed at how easily she had fooled me, surfaced on forums and gossip sites, then legitimate news outlets. The sympathy she had so desperately tried to cultivate evaporated like frost in the sun. Now she wasn't a survivor. She was a schemer, a social climber, a fraud. Public opinion didn't just shift, it shattered. And I hadn't lifted a finger. I simply watched, detached, from another city, already miles ahead, as she floundered in the world she had once commanded. One night, weeks after the dossier had detonated the last vestiges of trust in Cremont, she tried to find me. Word reached me through a friend who still did some security work in the city. Eliza had shown up at the seedy motel where I had spent those first brutal nights, the very one I had long since vacated. She had banged on doors, screaming my name down the empty corridors, waking the drifters and desperate men who had no idea who she was. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her voice cracking with panic. I wasn't there. I hadn't been there for months. While she raged, addressing ghosts, I sat in a gleaming glass tower on the other side of the country in a freshly pressed suit, my voice calm as I addressed a room full of new investors, men and women whose portfolios dwarfed anything Cremont had ever touched, titans of tech, real estate, manufacturing, people who understood value, people who had seen the reports I had orchestrated and wanted a piece of what came next. The irony wasn't lost on me. The life Eliza and Frederick had thrown me out of, the one they thought they controlled, had been nothing more than the starting gun. What I was building now wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was a rebirth on a scale they could never have imagined, let alone touched. Sitting across from billionaires in elegant conference rooms, discussing plans that would ripple through entire industries for decades, I understood something Eliza never would. You don't recover by clinging to what was lost. You recover by becoming something so much bigger that the old wounds can't even reach you. Meanwhile, Eliza's life was shrinking. Her world, once so wide and full of shallow adoration, was collapsing like a dying star. Fewer photos were posted, fewer events attended. Her name vanished from the society pages. Even her most desperate attempts, tearful interviews on second-rate talk shows, heart-wrenching apologies crafted by PR teams, fell flat. The public had moved on, as it always does. She had become something of an afterthought, a footnote, a cautionary tale. For a fleeting moment, I considered what it must be like to be abandoned by the very people you once believed you controlled. To look around and realize that without your illusions, you were nothing but an empty shell. I thought of the night she had thrust that envelope into my chest, her bags already packed, her voice dripping with contempt. I thought of the homeless shelter brochure she had tossed at me as if I were garbage to be neatly disposed of. And then I smiled, because now, as she reached out for help, as she screamed into the void she herself had created, all she found was silence, the very silence she had left me with. And I hadn't had to lift a finger to punish her. The world had done it for me. I moved through those days with a quiet certainty, my focus solely on what lay ahead. Eliza's downfall was no longer my concern. I had a new life to build, and there was no room in it for old ghosts. There were meetings to attend, partnerships to forge, skyscrapers to put my name on. I didn't look back. I didn't check her social media. I didn't scan the tabloids. If her name flickered across a headline, I simply scrolled past, the way you might ignore an advertisement for something you no longer need. Eliza had made her choices, and now she was living with them, just as I was living with mine, stronger, sharper, and freer than I had ever been under her shadow. Somewhere in an empty hotel room or a rented apartment, perhaps Eliza sat with her phone in her hand, scrolling through memories she couldn't reclaim. Maybe she whispered my name into the darkness, hoping for an answer that would never come. I had already answered, in the only way that truly mattered, by leaving her behind with nothing but the echoes of the life she had lost. Frederick Langston had always walked as if he owned the ground beneath his feet, chest out, chin high, surveying the world with a gaze that said, "I built this, dare you question it?" Even in boardrooms where multi-billion-dollar deals hung in the sigh, "Balance." He carried himself with an almost casual arrogance, secure in the belief that no one could touch him. For years, that confidence had been his armor, and in many ways, his weapon. But pride worn too long becomes brittle, and the world he believed was his had already begun to crumble beneath him long before he noticed. Frederick's fall wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was slower, more humiliating, like a man bleeding out from wounds he couldn't see. The banks were the first to turn. One by one, the financial institutions that had once clamored for a seat at his table began to issue demands instead of invitations. Letters once couched in flowery corporate jargon now arrived marked urgent, with repayment schedules, suspended lines of credit, and demanded audits. At first, Frederick must have believed it was a mistake, some kind of system error. Perhaps he yelled at his CFOs, demanded explanations from his accountants, throwing tantrums behind closed doors. But money doesn't make mistakes. Money listens to fear, and the financial world was afraid of what Cressmont had become. Then came the investors, the lifeblood of any corporate behemoth. The very men and women who had once raised champagne flutes to Frederick's visionary leadership now held private meetings without him, emergency sessions filled with whispered calculations and contingency plans. They had smelled the rot, and loyalty evaporated faster than spilled wine on hot pavement. By the time the board of directors called for an unprecedented vote of no confidence, Frederick must have finally understood that no amount of bluster could save him. I pictured him standing there, in that vast, cold boardroom where sunlight streamed in stripes across polished tables and walls adorned with plaques, celebrating achievements he had barely earned, watching the hands rise against him. Some out of fear, some out of opportunism, but most out of the simple human instinct to abandon a sinking ship. The official story fed to the press was almost laughable. Frederick Langston, stepping down to focus on his health and family. A carefully crafted statement delivered with the shaky dignity of a man who had no other choice. Behind the scenes, it wasn't dignity driving him. It was survival. Resignation was the only card he had left to play to avoid lawsuits, criminal investigations, utter annihilation. And yet, even stripped of his crown, Frederick tried to reach me. The last message came on a rainy Thursday, my phone vibrating with a number I knew by heart but hadn't dialed in months. For a moment, I simply stared at it, the memories of all those years rising like a bitter tide. The years of working late to meet impossible deadlines, sacrificing time, health, love, all to prove myself in his eyes that had never seen me as anything more than a pawn. I let the call go to voicemail. Later, when I listened to it, the message was short, devoid of anger or threats, just a hoarse voice heavy with defeat. Please, let's talk. That was all. No apologies, no acknowledgments, just an empty plea from a man who had finally understood that power once lost cannot be reclaimed with a polite request. I didn't reply. Some things deserve silence more than revenge, and Frederick Langston's downfall was too complete, too inevitable to require anything from me. I pictured him now, alone in that vast, empty house Eliza had once paraded through in her Instagram stories, the chandeliers casting cold light on rooms devoid of purpose. I pictured the wine cellars he no longer stocked, the closets full of designer suits he no longer had reason to wear. I pictured him sitting at the massive oak desk, the very one he had once lectured me from, now cluttered with unpaid bills and legal summons instead of quarterly reports. There was no need for words. My silence was louder than any victory speech. Frederick had spent his life building walls so high he couldn't see the people he crushed beneath them. And now, at the end, he was trapped within those very walls, abandoned by the very empire he thought would outlast him. He had miscalculated not just the markets, not just the loyalty of his investors, but me. He had mistaken silence for weakness, loyalty for foolishness, patience for powerlessness. He had spent his life training to defeat men who came at him with swords drawn, never understanding that the greatest threat is the one who smiled, who bowed, who played the game, and then dismantled the entire playing field. I didn't celebrate Frederick's fall. I didn't need to. Real victories don't taste of champagne or gunpowder. They taste of the air after a storm, sharp, clean, electric with possibility. They feel like freedom in your bones, like standing on the edge of a world that is finally yours. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, letting the rain wash over me as I walked away from the cafe where I had heard his voicemail. The city stretched around me, alive, full of 1,000 new beginnings, deals to be made, futures to be shaped, battles to be won. And somewhere in the ruins of Cresmont, Frederick Langston was staring at the ashes of everything he had built, understanding too late that the pawn he had discarded had never been a pawn at all. I had always been the architect. I had always been the storm. Under my real name, Julian Blackwood, I rose from the ashes of the life they had tried to bury me in and stepped into the world I was always meant to shape. No more hiding behind shell corporations, no more masks or false humility. I introduced Vanguard Horizons to the world like a king unsheathing a sword long hidden in stone. A consulting firm on paper, yes, but Vanguard Horizons was so much more. It was a living machine, an entity built not to survive within the old system, but to outthink it, outmaneuver it, consume it. At the press conference, camera flashes erupted in a furious storm as I stood at the podium, calm and composed. Behind me, on a massive digital screen, the sleek new logo shimmered, a stylized V cleanly bisecting a rising sun. Symbolic, perhaps even poetic, but make no mistake, Vanguard was a weapon, honed and sharp. The headlines came fast and loud. Phantom genius reimagines industry. Unknown power player unveils Vanguard Horizons. Tech giants back new consulting titan. I didn't correct them, didn't give interviews explaining where I had been or why no one had heard of me before. I let the mystery fuel the momentum. People are drawn to shadows, to untold stories. They built their own legends around my name, and I gave them just enough fuel to keep the fire burning. The first deals closed within weeks. Major tech firms, real estate moguls, private equity groups, they came to me with their tangled problems, their impossible ambitions, and I gave them clarity, strategy, power. Where Cresmont had bloated with arrogance, Vanguard thrived on precision. Every move was calculated, every partnership surgically precise. I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. I was building alliances that mattered, a future that would last. And the clients Frederick had once considered his personal fiefdom flocked to me in droves. At first it was quiet, late-night emails, whispered conversations in the back rooms of galas and retreats. CEOs and founders understood that the man behind their best successes hadn't been Cresmont, it had been me. They came not just for the results, but for the chance to be part of something vital, something inevitable. One by one, they signed on. One by one, the pillars of Cresmont's influence crumbled to dust. Every deal I closed wasn't just building Vanguard, it was erasing another piece of the empire that had tried to erase me. And the cityscape, the very one I had once looked at with longing, burning the midnight oil in someone else's office, began to change. New towers rose with the Vanguard imprint subtly woven into their blueprints, infrastructure projects, data centers, luxury residences, all now bore my invisible but undeniable mark. I walked through the financial districts past the gleaming giants of glass and steel and felt their weight, the quiet knowledge that where others saw buildings, I saw battlefields already won. I hadn't just climbed back up the mountain. I had rebuilt the entire mountain in my own name. There was no need for grand gestures, no petty campaigns of revenge, no desire to flaunt my success in Frederick or Eliza's faces. Their worlds had already shrunk to the point where they couldn't touch mine, even if they screamed my name into the wind. Still, every now and then, I would hear whispers. Eliza's desperate attempts to stay afloat, launching a half-dead lifestyle brand that failed before it truly began. Frederick's lawsuits, dismissed one by one as he futilely tried to claw back something he had never truly owned. None of it mattered. Their downfall had been sealed the moment they tried to bury a man who had already outgrown their graves. I live differently now, not in ostentatious displays or gilded palaces. My home is a penthouse in a tower I helped design, overlooking the city from a height that feels almost unfair. Floor-to-ceiling windows flood the rooms with light during the day, and at night, the entire skyline twinkles like a galaxy at my feet. It's not about the wealth, not about proving anything. It's about breathing air that smells of freedom, standing in a life I built with no debts, no chains, no apologies. There's a peace in that kind of success, an unshakable quiet that no betrayal can ever steal back. In the quiet hours, I sit on the terrace, the city humming below, and think about the path that led me here, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a kind of detached wonder. Every setback, every betrayal, every night spent in a cold car, every door slammed in my face, every bitter lesson, it had all been necessary. All of it had forged me into the man I am now. Julian Blackwood wasn't a victim of Cressmont. He was the architect of its end, and Vanguard Horizons was only the beginning. The world didn't even realize yet how much it was about to change, but it would soon. 6 months later, almost to the day, she found me. It was a clear autumn afternoon, the air crisp with the scent of dying leaves and burgeoning ambition. I was sitting at a small cafe, tucked away on the edge of a bustling square, nursing a black coffee and reviewing project notes on my tablet, when I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, and there she was, Eliza. She hesitated for a moment at the entrance, clutching her purse tightly, scanning the tables until her gaze locked with mine. As she moved towards me, there was none of the effortless confidence with which she had once commanded rooms. This was a different woman entirely. Her steps were uncertain, almost clumsy, her clothes still designer, but lacking that certain sheen, that whisper of privilege. Her hair was styled, but not quite perfectly. The armor of perfection she had once worn had cracked in 100 places, and all I saw now was the fear she tried so hard to conceal. She stopped at my table, swallowing hard before speaking. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, softer, as if it might break apart with a single breath. "Julian," she said, "please, can we talk?" I lowered my tablet slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. A few heads turned at nearby tables, sensing the tension, the familiarity of two people standing on opposite sides of a war that had already been lost. I gestured silently to the chair opposite me. Let her choose. Let her sit in the consequences she herself had created. She slid into the chair, placing her purse on her lap like a shield. For a moment, she simply looked at me, truly looked, searching for the man she thought she had known, the man she had molded and discarded like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. But that man was gone, and the one sitting before her now belonged to neither her memory, nor her guilt, nor her regrets. Tears welled in her eyes almost immediately. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was doing what was best for me. I didn't realize how much." She trailed off, wiping her eyes with shaking fingers. I watched without emotion, sipping my coffee as she floundered. "I miss you," she finally said. "Can we start over, please, Julian? I've changed, I see that now. We were good together. We can be again." The scent of her perfume drifted across the table, familiar as a weapon, the very fragrance she had worn the night we first met at a Cressmont gala, the very scent that had once twisted my gut with longing. She was trying to pull me back into a memory, to tether me to something that no longer existed. I set my cup down carefully, folded my hands on the table, and leaned forward slightly. "You fell in love with a mask I wore for you, Eliza," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You never loved the real me. You loved the version you could control, the one you thought you could mold into whatever suited your next ambition." She shook her head frantically, her lips trembling in protest, but I raised a hand and she fell silent. The man sitting across from you now, I continued, you wouldn't even recognize. You never bothered to try. And the truth is, he doesn't recognize you either. Her face crumpled, her shoulders slumped, the last carefully rehearsed arguments dying on her tongue. She understood then, truly understood, that there was no going back, no reset button, no forgiveness waiting in the wings. What we had shared hadn't been sleeping beneath the surface, waiting for her to awaken it. It had vanished, burned away by every cruel word, every calculated betrayal. I rose slowly, gathering my tablet and jacket in a quiet, deliberate movement. She watched me, blinking rapidly, as if she couldn't quite believe I was actually leaving, as if the right words would still fall from the sky and fix everything before it was too late. But life doesn't work that way, not for people like her, not anymore. I pushed my chair back under the table, nodded once, politely, finally, and left her there, sitting in a sea of strangers who didn't care who she used to be, who wouldn't stop to ask why the beautiful woman at the corner table was crying into a designer scarf. Stepping out into the sunlight, I felt the world sharpen, grow clearer. The city moved around me, alive and indifferent, and I felt no anger, no sadness, no longing, only freedom. I had already said everything that needed to be said, not with words, but with the life I had built without her. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Somewhere behind me, at least, she clung to memories that could no longer touch me, and I walked forward into a future that belonged only to me. I live quietly now, not hidden, not diminished, just separate. There's a difference. I don't crave the spotlight the way Frederick did, basking in its glare until it burned him. I don't need the applause or the fanfare. True power doesn't announce itself with flashing lights and roaring crowds. It moves like a current beneath the surface, silent and inexorable. Every contract I sign, every building that rises from blueprints I once sketched alone in those lost years, every company I touch, they all carry the reminder of who I am now. Vanguard Horizon stretches like an unseen hand across industries and borders, influencing board decisions and government policies, moving billions with a whisper. I don't need my name on every door. I don't need statues erected in my honor. The mark I leave is in the way the world subtly, quietly shifts around what I build. Sometimes I catch echoes of what I left behind. A news article mentioning Vanguard's latest acquisition, a skyline punctuated by a tower whose foundation I laid, a policy change at a company once considered unshakable. Each one a testament not to vengeance, but to resurrection, a simple, unwavering truth that no betrayal, no exile, no broken heart could ever extinguish what I always carried within me. The man they discarded, the man Eliza pushed out the door without a second thought, the man Frederick waved away with a curt nod, became the architect of their undoing without ever raising his voice in anger. Sometimes, I wonder if they see it. Does Eliza, sitting alone in some smaller, dimmer apartment than she once envisioned, scroll through her news feed and feel that cold stab of recognition when my name flickers across the screen? Does Frederick, in the lonely echo of his empty mansion, pretend it was bad luck, or the times, or some other excuse that brought down the empire he believed was invincible? I like to think not. Not because I want them to suffer, not anymore, but because there's something fitting, something poetic in knowing that what haunts them isn't rage, but the shadow of what they lost. I don't seek them out. I don't track their decline like a voyeur sipping champagne. I have no need. Their defeat was inevitable, sealed the moment they chose betrayal over loyalty, arrogance over wisdom. My legacy isn't in their ruins. It's in the empires I build now, the lives I change, the future I shape. I live simply, in a way few would understand. My penthouse is elegant, but not ostentatious. My clothes are tailored, but unremarkable. My days are filled with creation, not conquest. Because true power doesn't shout. It whispers, it moves patiently, inexorably through the world, unseen by those too blinded by their own vanity to recognize it. In the heart of my home, there's a small study, paneled in dark wood and lined with old books. Not gaudy trophies of success, but heavy, substantial ones, the kind that remind you how many lives came before, how many battles were won in silence. I often sit there at night, the city sprawling before me like a living map, and I think about the path that brought me here, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet wonder. Would I have chosen it, knowing the cost? Would I still have loved Eliza, still have trusted Frederick, still have believed in a world that rewards loyalty? Maybe. Maybe part of becoming stronger isn't erasing who you were, but carrying it with you, like a scar, something that once caused pain, but no longer defines you. I am not the man they tried to break. I am the man who was forged in the fire they lit around me. There's a freedom in that, a knowledge they will never possess. Sometimes I receive letters, offers, invitations, attempts to draw me back into the games I once played. High-profile galas, exclusive memberships, the search for a powerful figure to showcase. Most of them I decline, politely but firmly. Let others chase titles and headlines. I have no need to stand in the spotlight when I can move the world from the shadows. Because in the end, that is my legacy. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. A quiet, relentless force reshaping the world long after those who tried to erase me are forgotten. And somewhere, late at night, when the city hushes and the skyline twinkles like distant stars, I know Eliza and Frederick, wherever they are, still feel it, still remember the man they discarded, the shadow they thought would fade. But shadows don't fade. They linger, they grow, they become the very foundation upon which new empires rise. I lean back in my chair, the quiet hum of the city below like a heartbeat in my ears, and I smile, not with triumph, but with understanding. The legacy I leave isn't etched in marble or broadcast in headlines. It's etched in the bones of the world they once thought they ruled, and it will outlast their names when the last echoes of them fade into silence.